Good afternoon, students. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how to write good poetry. So if you want to write poetry, for me, writing poetry helps me release stress, helps me express my emotions, because when we write poetry, we are writing about our emotions. We're painting a picture for the reader about how we feel at a given time. So let's go. There are no officially sanctioned rules of poetry, of how to write poetry. However, as with all creative writing, having some degree of structure can help you rein in your ideas and work productively. Here are some guidelines for writing poetry. First, read a lot of poetry. If you want to write poetry, start by reading poetry. You can do this in a casual way, by taking a poetry class, by letting the words of your favorite poems wash over you without necessarily digging for deeper meanings. Or you can delve into analysis, dissect an allegory in a Robert Frost verse, ponder the underlying meaning of an Edward Hirsch poem, retrieve the symbolism in Emily Dickinson's work, do a line-by-line analysis of a William Shakespeare sonnet. Simply let the individual words of a Walt Whitman elegy flow with emotion. Listen to live poetry recitations. The experience of consuming poetry does not have to be an academic exercise in cataloging poetic devices like alliteration and metony. It can be musical, such as when you attend a poetry slam for the first time and hear the snappy consonants of a poem read out loud. Many coffee houses have poetry readings, and these can be both fun and instructive for aspiring poets. By listening to the sounds of good poetry, you discover the beauty of its construction, the mix of stressed and unstressed syllables, alliteration and assonance, a well-placed internal rhyme, clever line breaks, and more. You'll never think of the art form of poetry the same way once you hear good poetry read out loud. And so poetry is meant to be read out loud. Start small. A short poem like haiku or a simple rhyming poem might be more attainable than diving into narrative logic. A simple rhyming poem can be a non-intimidating entryway into poetry writing. Don't mistake quantity for quality. A pristine 7-line free verse poem is more impressive than a sloppy, rambling epic of blank verse iambic pentameter. So start small. So when I used to teach elementary school, I had my students write short haikus. And so you don't, or you could just write down how you feel in your reader's journal, because that's what the reader's journal is for, where you experiment in writing your creative stories, or you write down your reactions to stories, or you write down small short poems. So start writing short stories and small poems in your reader's journal. This is all voluntary. This is not an assignment for your class. Don't obsess over your first line. If you don't feel you have exactly the right words to open your poem, don't give up there. Keep writing and come back to the first line when you're ready. The opening line is just one component of an overall piece of art. Don't give it more outsized importance than it needs. Embrace tools. If a thesaurus or a rhyming dictionary will help you complete a poem, use it. You'd be surprised how many professional writers make use of these tools. Just be sure you understand the true meaning of the words you insert into your poem. Some synonyms listed in a thesaurus will deviate from the meaning you wish to convey. Enhance the poetic form with literary devices. Like any form of writing, poetry is enhanced by literary devices. Develop your poetry writing skills by inserting metaphor, allegory, synedosh, metony, imagery, and other literary devices into your poems. This can be relatively easy in an unrhymed form like free verse, and more challenging in poetic forms that have strict rules about meter and rhyme scheme. Try telling a story with your poem. Many of the ideas you might express in a novel, a short story, or an essay can come out in a poem. A narrative poem like The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot can be as long as a novella. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe expresses just as much dread and menace as some horror movies. As with all forms of English language writing, communication is the name of the game. So if you want to tell short stories in your poem, go ahead. Embrace big ideas. A lyrical poem like Banish Air from Air by Emily Dickinson can express some of the same philosophical and political concepts you might articulate in an essay. Because good poetry is about precision of language, you can express a whole philosophy in very few words. You just have to choose the right words. Paint with your words. So when a poem paints with words, they use word choice to figuratively paint concrete images into a reader's mind. In the field of visual art, painting pictures, of course, refers to the act of representing people, objects, and scenery to behold with their own eyes. In creative writing, painting pictures also refers to producing a vivid picture of objects, people, and scenes. But the artist's medium is the written word. So you not only paint a picture of people and places, you also want to paint a picture of your emotion. Familiarize yourself with myriad forms of poetry. Each different form of poetry has its own requirements, scheme, rhyme scheme, number of lines, meter, subject matter, and more that make them unique from other poems. So if you want to be a good poetry writer, you need to read a lot of poems and be familiar with the styles and structures of other poetry writers. Connect with other poets. Poets connect with one another via poetry readings and perhaps poetry writing classes. Poets in an artistic community often read each other's work, recite their own poems aloud, and provide feedback on first drafts. Good poetry can take many forms, and through a community, you may encounter different forms that may vary from one type of poem to another. Seek out a poetry group where you can hear different kinds of poetry, where you can discuss the art form, jot down new ideas, and learn from the work of your peers. So here are 11 ways in which you can, tips in which you can embrace in order to learn how to write a poem. So in conclusion, so let me sum up. So the 11 ways to write a poem: read a lot of poetry, listen to live poetry recitations, start small, don't obsess over your first line, embrace tools like dictionaries, enhance the poetic form with literary devices, try telling a story with your poem, express big ideas, paint with words, familiarize yourself with different kinds of poetry, and last but not least, connect with other poets. I hope you found this article useful in inspiring you to write poetry on your own. And if you have any questions about this video, you can always email me.